Bim bam, hadi ra 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 ram, ra ra dram bam, ba ba bam 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 bam. Okay, so we're holding on the fourth page of the mimer, the second paragraph on the page in the middle of the ice. We were explaining on page it's Chaf Zayin in the Hebrew of the Dvar Malchus, and we were explaining about the Yom. What is it that that says וירד Yom ad Yom, and we were explaining what is the level of the two levels of Yom. There is Yam Hakadmoini, that is the first, the originator, the source of the irrigation, the source of the water. That's why it's called Yom Hakadmoini, because it's first. And there's Yom Ha'achron. There's the final sea. The final sea is the level of the where the sea receives. He said first Yam Ha'achron, then Yam Ha'kadmoini. But it's that aspect of the sea that's a receiver that gets all the rivers coming into it, and then there's a level of the sea which is the giver, the mashpia, the source. That's the Yam Ha'kadmoini. So now, based on understanding this in the simple sense of what are the two types of Yam, so now he's going to explain this, what this means in a person, and therefore, by understanding what this means in a person, we'll be able to understand the idea of ruling over it and so on. The Inyan, line 15, page, the fourth page of the copies. The Inyan Shnei, Fan Shesh Biyam. The two types of ways that there is in the sea, in the characteristics and the service of a person, shenikra elam cotton, that a person is called a miniature world. So therefore, this means that in a person, he has all the things of the big world. So just like in the world, there's the sea that receives, and then the sea also gives forth the same thing. The person has to reflect it also within himself, because he's a miniature world. Everything that's to be found in the world is to be found in the person. Like it says in Avos of Nasan that the hairs are like the forest, hairs on a person's head is like a forest, etc. It's also the flip side. Everything that's to be found in a person is to be found in the world. So therefore, we need to see what this idea of having these two levels of sea, Yama Kadmoini, Yama Achron, in the life of every single individual, what that is Yam, his sea that receives from all the rivers, and his sea that gives forth to all the rivers. Who using Chassidus terminology, who inyan chachma, you love chachma. It is the high level of chachma, the upper chachma, and the lower chachma. The lower chachma, the Rebbe can explain in Sfiras terminology, B'Shreinah Sfiras, in the terminology of Sfiras, who in chachma umalchus, the idea of chachma and malchus. Yama kadmoini, the first sea, the originator, that's chachma. The receiver, Yama achron, the final sea, the latter sea, the last sea, that is the level of malchus. And he's going to explain this in practical, what practically it means in our person, the way our nefesh works. But Pashtus and simply put, in Yama Kadmoini, in Yama Yaschalus Koichas Adam, the first C is the idea of the beginning of the powers of a person. Shal Yodam, Poil B'Machshava, Dibur Ma'aseh, through them, the person influences and affects his thought, speech, and deed. That's what begins with Chachmei Law. That's what begins with his Chachma. Lahoiris Lahem, to direct them. Mava Eich Lasois. First of all, what to do and how to do it. And the same thing, L'daber V'Lachshev. What to speak, how to speak, what to think, and how to think. In general, that's the level of the intellect that's in the head, is what directs the machshava dibur, the thought, speech, and deed. And Chabad, that's divided into the three sections of Chabad, Chachma, Bina, Das. Moving for this understood. What is considered the first sea, the early sea? In the soul powers, it is the first power that precedes and comes before all the other powers. That is the power, the level of the brain, of the point of Chochmah, because that is the originator of everything. From this comes on afterwards in Bina, and afterwards it comes on from that into Das. But Pash doesn't simply put initially there's the point of the intellect. From that point of the intellect, from that originating thought. Yam Akadmoini, he begins to think and have the level of bina, elaboration. He breaks it down to details, to its length and to its width. Top of page in a way of the broadness of the river, the bina of bina. Afterwards, it comes down the level of das. That he takes this idea that originated in Chachma, was developed in Bina, and then he used the das, which Alter Rebbe says in Tanya Perek Gimel, that das is the idea that he's inserting and investing his mind in strength into that idea. He really joins with it, really connects with it. That's the chain order of descent in the person's soul powers. It begins from the first point of the Seichel, that is the early seed. That's the first level. From the intellect, it comes down into our feeling in the heart. Afterwards, the thought, and from thought to speech, until we come down to action. The level of action, that is the final level, the last level of the Seder Ishtalshlus of the soul powers in a person's life. Therefore, action now we've identified right now as Nikra Yama Achron is called the final C. So in Spirit, the first C, Yama Kadmoini, is Chochmah Elah. Yama Achron, the final C, that's Malchus. In a person's own nefesh, the first C, Yam HaKadmoini, that's the level of Chochmah and Seichel in general, which gives birth to all the other powers that result from it. And action is the Yama Achron, which is, on the one hand, it's a receiver from all. But the Rebbe is going to explain, just because the receiver is not something to be like, okay, it's the last online, whatever. So that's what he's going to explain right now. Dalet. Ois Dalet, line 9. These two aspects, Chochmah and Malchus, Chochmah and Maisem, the Yom HaKadmoini, the Yom HaAchron, Yesh B'chol Echad, Mailul Gaba Sheni. Each one has an advantage over the other. Mailus HaChochmah, Yom HaKadmoini, the advantage of Chochmah, which is the early C, the first C, that in it is dependent the entire way how the person runs and acts. Because a person has to act, a human being, and especially a Yid, has to act directed by his intellect, by his mind. A person shouldn't be acting only by a desire alone, without any explanation, without any logic. Through this, that the way things are set in his mind is in the way it's supposed to be, meaning it follows the logic and reasoning of Torah and so on. So then when he does that, so then I'm sorry, then all of his way of acting is the way it's supposed to be, because his hanacha in the seichel is the way it's supposed to be. So his actions are the way a human being, the way he's supposed to act. So now we can understand why the pasuk says about Mashiach, and we said that prior to Mashiach's coming, we have to have it ourselves as well. Therefore, there has to be the rulership, the control. Like it says, Viyerd miyam ad yam. One needs to control and rule over the first sea. Each one of us has to rule within ourselves, like Mashiach will rule over the first sea. In that first sea, Shuin Askal Saseichel, that the first sea we said is the beginning of Seichel. That this is dependent, the general way of acting, but even in such a way that it says over there in that capital Tilim also, the Mishpatechel Melech Tames Koskala Ben Melech, that you give your laws to a king, meaning the Jewish people are called kings. But it Koskon, your righteousness, you give to a prince. In other words, that we act in accordance, we who are the kings and princes act in accordance Lefi Mishpatei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, according to the laws of Hashem. That happens when we have internally Viyerd Miyam, that we rule over the first, the Yamakadmoini, we rule over our intellect, because then the intellect will bring about the emotions and the actions. That is the quality of the first sea, and that is the mile of the first sea. But then he says in line 19, there's another quality as well. The Idach Yisab, on the other hand, the completion of perfection is only when there's the final sea, Maisa, and action, like the Achamim learned in their Mishnah, and they taught, action is what's primary. So as great as the Yom HaKadmoini is, the level of Chachma, because it leads to all these things, but ultimately it has to lead to action. As long as it didn't come down to action, even after it comes down to thought, and even in speech, we still don't know how it will be in action. Since it could still be, like it says in a different place until that in their mouths and their tongues, they have said the right things. In other words, their speech is fine, but it never came out in action. Even though it says their heart is not correct with them, the point that the Pasuk is trying to say, they talk a good talk, but they don't do a good walk. They don't act upon it. So as great and as wonderful that the person's Yama Kadmoini is, and they could have all the right thoughts and all the right emotions and all the right everything, but he doesn't have the action, then Azai Chaser Kol Shleimus Adam, then the entire perfection of a person is lacking, like we see in our senses. It could be that the matter should be applied in the seichel the way it's supposed to be. But he's lacking the idea of the brain ruling over the heart, or even lower than the idea of the heart, the level of action, top of page, Chavtes, that he becomes, instead of, or Lamatim is not only the lacking the brain ruling over the heart, but it becomes transformed. Shenasa Bereshus Libli. It can have like a standoff. The brain is not ruling over his heart, but his heart is not also having any balabatishka. But it's not that way. He's using an expression that the Chazal used, that tzaddikim, libam b'rshus, some tzaddikim, their heart is in their control and possession. But the opposite of tzaddikim, so it says just the opposite, that they are controlled by their heart. So not only is the person lacking the brain, is not having that the brain exerts control over the heart, but even worse than that, that he becomes within the control of his heart's controlling him. To us, when that takes place, again, top of page Chavtes, not only is he not listening to his brain, even more so, Shataiva v'arotzen matim es aseichel la'asiroi b'derech akalosai. That his desire and his will turn his seichel to turn it away in a crooked manner. In other words, the desire, just like there's moyach shalat al lev, there is lev shalat al moyach, meaning it's not that I'm just ignoring my moyach and I'm saying, you know what, I'm too much, the desire and the taiva is too strong. I'm just going to listen to my taivas. It's more to that. The desire is so strong that he convinces his brain to follow along. The desire convinces his brain to think, yeah, following taivas is a good thing. It's a logical thing. It's a correct thing. And of course, he'll use his brain for other types of justifications and other ways to be able to find more taivas, etc., etc. Tzadze line 4, he said, yeah, yom ha'achron, yoitzer masher yam ha'kadmoini. For this reason, the final C, meaning action, is more important than the first C, which is chachma. We see this actually by Matan Torah, how the final C, how action was more important than the first C, which is the level of chachma. During Matan Torah, that's when the foundations were laid for the existence of the Yidden as a nation. Sadia going like that. Sadia going said, our nation is not a nation only through its Torah. That the condition for the acceptance of the Torah was prefacing and saying, Nasa we will do before Nishma. Nishma is the Yom HaKadmoini, it's Seichel, understanding. Nasa is about doing, that's the Yom HaAchron. This means first and foremost, the person has to accept upon himself that he should have the doing it in action b'poil. Only afterwards comes the idea of understanding, from the word understanding and comprehension. This means to put in effort to understand this in such a way that also his mind should understand that one has to do it. In other words, I have to be so committed to the action that the action leads my intellect. Not like we said before, that his emotions cause his intellect to become falsified and think that this particular taiva is correct, but that's the opposite. My commitment to Hashem and action to do the right thing convinces my thought process to follow along rationally, to be able to understand this way of doing things and so on. That's line 14. Only acting in such a way that you have given precedence to your mouth over your ears, like the guy told one of the Tanoim or Amoraim in the Gemara. Meaning, what's it mean you gave precedence to your mouth over your ears? Before you even heard the Torah, you accepted upon yourself to do it. That's the meaning of Nasa before Nishma that the guy says concerning the Yid. But then he b'chinas tumas yesharim tanchim. That's the sincerity of the straight ones will lead them. Like the words of the Gemara Masechtas Shabbos that the Gemara over there explains, that when the pasuk says that the sincerity of the straight ones led them, that means the Yidden sincerity by Matan Torah, by saying we will do before saying we will understand. And what's it mean? It will lead them to this attitude of doing before understanding leads the Yidden as a nation. And it leads every individual Yid as an individual and a specific person. In other words, it's not just in the macro, but it's also in the micro, and every single person that leads in that way. in his way, in his road on life. Let's go on to line 21. Since there's an advantage in one that isn't to be found in the other, there's an advantage in Yom HaKadmoini Chochma over Yom HaAchron Mais, and there's an advantage in action in Yom HaAchron over Yom HaKadmoini, over the first sea of Chochma. Therefore it says, V'yerd mi Yom Ad Yom Stam. Therefore it says an interesting thing. It says, he will rule from sea to sea without identifying which seas he's talking about. It doesn't say he will rule from the early sea to the final sea, or from the final sea to the early sea. He doesn't identify which seas come first. There are those people that because of the nature of their soul, because of their soul characteristics and traits, their rulership starts in a way that first your laws are given to the king, meaning it starts from the idea of Chachma. It starts from the first seat, from the early seat. Yes, it's mitzad kunas nafshi nokla yosel lahanig ashlita lam shalom. And there are certain people that because of the characteristics of their soul, it's easier for him to run and control and to lead through the fact that he begins from action and actuality from the final sea. There are different people with different natures. Because of that, he doesn't say which yam should come from first. Miyam ad yam, from sea to sea. Maybe some people have to start from the final sea first, and some people may have to start from the first sea first. But by every single year, top of page lamed, Sarach Liyash and Yonim has to be both aspects. Yam ad yam. There has to be from sea to sea. Hanging and al-limud has to be both study, which is Yom HaKadmoini, the early sea, the first sea. Hanging and Amaisa, Yom HaAchron, and both of the final sea, the action, mitach shlita v'mshallah, in a way of control and rulership. V'yerd, like the word is v'yerd, v'oifen shal kiyum la'adol oil melam, in a way of an everlasting way, and forever and ever. Kol Meshach Chayev Alei Adomus, for the duration of his life upon this earth, v'gam la'achrizeh, even after his life upon this earth. Perhaps the Rebbe is referring to Mashiach's times. It always needs to be this way of Yerd Ma Yom Ad Yom until Minahar Vad Afsi. Oishei, line 6. Let's stop over here. If anybody has any questions, let's. Oishei, line 6. 7th page of the copies. Calls man saying in the Vierd my Yom Ad Yom, as long as ruling from sea to sea is only concerning the characteristics of his soul, his soul traits. All the way beginning from the power of Chachma, reaching down to the power of action. And included in all of this, we're not going to skip over the ones in between, but it's included within this Gam Regish Hamidus, Ava V'Yirish B'Lev, also the feeling of the emotions, the love and awe of the heart. And before this, also the idea of will. So, though a person has all of these things present, still in all, it's only a matter that's internal. It doesn't touch and doesn't matter for the general world. In other words, it doesn't impact outside of the person. Well, after going through all of this, he has from his chachma, through his action, he is with the program. But still in all, he could lock himself up. Or afilim base, it could be even with his household locked up, within his room. And to remain within his 4 cubits, in other words, within his own place. And he can think that he doesn't need to be involved with the world. But Hashem has to worry about his world. Avraham Avinu recognized that Hashem is the owner of this building, this palace. Yisak in this oilam, he will fix up the world. That's not my problem. It's not my issue. I have my yom. I have my chachma till my action and everything in between, and my family, and we're all in fortress of Yiddishkeit within my own home, and that's it. The number of concerning this is said in the continuation of the after there's the idea that we will rule from sea to sea, to be able to exclude such an approach, that it's enough that a person just deals with his own internal self, or at most within his internal household, and not deal with the world at large. That's why it doesn't stop by the words v'yed miyam ad yom, but actually tzarech liyos gam u'menahar ad afsei oretz. It also has to be from the river till the ends of the earth. And he's explained this right now, what this means from the river till the ends of the earth. The idea behind this is line 18, the ordinary meaning of the word river, when it says in Tanakh, it says the term river without identifying it and connecting it with anything else, is referring to the river Pros Euphrates. You can abide in Tanakh, like commentaries on Tanakh write in many places. Like it says also in Bereshis, Vanor Haravi Hu Pros, where it talks about that the four rivers that came out from one river. So the fourth river, it says, is Pras. So the Chazal say, who Pras the Mikara. This Pras is the one, that the river that he initially spoke about. And Niskala Maila, that's mentioned beforehand, it says, V'nar Yotzim Eden L'Hash Sagan. It says that the river goes out of Eden to irrigate the garden. That the three rivers are coming out of that Nahar. So the Nahar ad Afsei Oretz is talking about this river of Pras, that is the main river that has to do with Gan Eden. So we identify Nahar now with Gan Eden. The idea of Gan Eden is Gan Eden is the place where it was the home of Adam Rishon at the beginning of creation. And not just the beginning of creation, but the way the world was, and the way Adam Rishon was, and the way Gan Eden was in its perfection before the sin. Now, this perfection of Gan Eden is also understood concerning Mashiach's times. The perfection of the world corresponds and is similar to, though it's Mashiach's times, it's so much higher. So it says in the brackets, and this is understood that concerning the perfection that will be in the days of Mashiach, we can understand it from the perfection of the world before the Chet Eitzadas. Like it's brought down the Medrash, twice it says the word toildos with the vavs written out, which indicates that it's perfection and completion and nothing missing. Whereas when it says toildos missing a letter vav, that indicates that something is lacking. And twice when it says it is, but Chilas Habriya, at the beginning of creation, it says, Ela toildos hashmayim v'aretz bibaram, this is the birth and the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created. In the days of Mashiach, it says, Ela toildos paretz, this is the birth of Paretz, the son of Yehuda and Tamar, which is the offspring, which will come from that Mashiach. So, in other words, they share this common thing about the perfection that was in the world in Gan Eden. But Gan Eden, Hashem replaced in Gan Eden to work it and to guard it. We'll stop over here. We're still in the middle of identifying that Nahar Pras has to do with the level of Gan Eden.